Let's continue the arts theme. It's time now for this week's Meet the Author with Nick Hyam.
Malcolm Gladwell writes worldwide bestsellers which combine compelling storytelling with social science research to make you look at the world in a slightly different way. He wrote The Tipping Point, followed it up with Blink, about the power of our subconscious, and then wrote Outliers, which looked at why some people are so remarkably more successful than others. His latest book is called David and Goliath and subtitled Underdogs, Misfits and the Art of Battling Giants. Its message: apparent strength may sometimes be a weakness. Malcolm Gladwell, your thesis in this book is that apparent strength can in fact be a weakness, and apparent weakness can in fact be a strength. David and Goliath is the classic example of that. Just explain how it worked in that case.
Oh, well, there's two elements to it. One is that David's sling, which is sometimes thought of as a kind of child's toy, is in fact one of the most devastating weapons available to ancient warriors. In fact, the ballistics experts have calculated that the stone that he propels towards Goliath's forehead would have had stopping power equivalent of a 45 caliber pistol. The other element of this is that Goliath, there's a lot of active speculation about whether there's something wrong with Goliath. Many endocrinologists believe he suffered from something called acromegaly, which is a disease caused by a benign tumor in your pituitary gland, which would account for his size, but more importantly, has a common side effect of restricting vision. And if you read the biblical account, he does sound an awful lot like someone who doesn't see very well. He's led onto the valley floor by an attendant, for example, which makes no sense. And he doesn't pick up the fact that David's not intending to fight him until the very last moment. And so you add those together, you have a boy with superior technology up against a big lumbering giant who has severely restricted vision. That's not a story of an improbable victory against overwhelming odds by an underdog, is it? It's something very close to, well, you could even argue that David is almost the favorite in that context.
But there are, throughout the book, you advance sort of stories, narratives which will support this thesis. In some cases, it really does look, though, as if there is no hidden advantage to the weaker side. You talk, for instance, about the civil rights movement in America, in Birmingham, Alabama, as against the police. The black community there really was seriously weak, wasn't it?
Yes, and King, we forget that when Martin Luther King comes to Birmingham, which is the climactic moment in the history of the Civil Rights Act, he was coming off his biggest defeat, and many people in the black community had given up on him. And in the early days when he's marching against Bull Connor, this white supremacist who was the police chief in Birmingham, King was getting 12 people to march. That's as many as he could convince. So he had nothing. And that chapter is all about, well, what do you do when you have nothing, right? What's left to you when you have zero obvious advantages? And the answer is, what's left to you are your wits. And that, the Birmingham story is a story of the kind of ingenuity that comes from desperation.
Another very telling chapter is the one in which you dissect the argument for class sizes in schools. The idea is that if you have a big class, it's unteachable, it's uncontrollable, so you need smaller class sizes. I don't quite see how this fits in with the general thesis of the book, but it's a powerful argument that actually you can have such a thing as a class that's too small.
Yeah, it picks up on the theme that one of the mistakes that people with privilege make is they think that the resources they have automatically make them better off. And so what I wanted to do in a series of chapters on education was to point to to instances of the self-defeating nature of privilege. And class size is a classic example of this, that one of the things that many exclusive schools advertise is the fact they have very small classes, maximize the kind of attention that a teacher can play to a pupil. But in fact, if you look very carefully at both the research, and I talked to hundreds of teachers about this, they will tell you, past a certain point, classes can very clearly be too small, that the educational environment suffers when you reduce the pool of students too much.
Is this because they don't interact with
They
one
don't
another
interact.
positively?
They don't. Students who are struggling really need to have a true peer in the class in order to be able to feel like they're keeping up with the program. And you reduce that possibility when the class is too small. So these are a series of, I mean, half of the book is concerned with ways in which, why does the giant fall? And that's what this is an example of. Giants fall because they use their enormous resources to buy things that don't help them and that in fact hurt them. Right? And this is a gorgeous example of that.
The criticism that's sometimes made of your work is that you prioritize the story at the expense of the social science evidence, that you cherry pick what you want, you ignore what you don't want. And there's a chapter in here about dyslexia, which seems in this particular case to have generated a lot of controversy from people who say the thesis in that, which is that having dyslexia can for some people be a desirable difficulty because it forces them to work harder to overcome the disability, but that you don't substantiate that argument.
Well, you know, I make it very plain that I'm only talking about some dyslexics. In fact, I'm only talking about a minority of them. And my evidence is, one, studies that have, more than one, that have shown a very, very large percentage of entrepreneurs, successful entrepreneurs, have dyslexia. Now, that does not prove causation, but it is a very suggestive correlation between those two things. And the other thing is just the stories of, I go and talk to these people and have them account for their lives. Now, is that definitive? No. But not everything. Some of the most interesting and thought-provoking ideas are not at the stage where we can call them definitive. They're at the stage where we ought to think about them and play with them and see if they make sense. And my books aren't, I'm not going to publish that chapter in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, but as a way of provoking people to think about the role that certain kinds of obstacles can play in compensatory learning. It's a very useful exercise. What
impact do you hope your books will have? Because they're a diverting read, they're thought-provoking, they confront one with interesting and sometimes novel ideas. But is that enough that I, as the reader, should take something away from it, or do you hope for something more?
I'm not trying to. I always say my books are not intended to persuade people. I'm not trying to build an army of Malcolm think-alikes. I'm quite happy when people disagree. In fact, I think disagreement is it is one of the most valuable forms of engagement. What I want is for people to take ideas seriously, to say, you know, let's think about dyslexia, even if you end up believing that, you know what, this is not a productive line of approach. That's fine, but let's at least consider it.
Thank you very well. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.